Top Gun is directed by Tony Scott, starring Tom Cruise, Val Kilmer, Kelly McGillis, amongst a huge slew of people that you may or may not recognize from the era of the 1980s. With Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 coming up soon, I thought about discussing some Tom Cruise movies that aren't necessarily in the Mission Impossible franchise. I have a review of the fifth one somewhere on my channel. It was a while ago. But since Tom Cruise is arguably the biggest Hollywood star right now, why not talk about some of his other movies in honor of his new one coming up? Starting off with this great classic. We all know what the plot of this movie is by now, but it's a very simple one. Pete Mitchell, or Maverick, and his wingman Goose are assigned to Top Gun, which is a training center for select naval pilots that receive the best type of training for when they go into combat. Given his call sign, Maverick is known to be a loose cannon, and shows to be somewhat of a problem child in the training program, while his buddy Goose tries to keep him in line. I apologize for the way I sound. I had a really bad cold last week. I'm feeling a lot better now, but I'm still kind of getting over it, so hopefully I can get through this review without messing up my voice any further. Watching this movie again recently, I didn't really notice a whole ton of emotional depth overall. It's mostly reserved when Goose eventually dies, and Maverick considers quitting afterward, and Viper, the one in charge of the school, reveals to him certain information about his father, Maverick's father. But the experience of watching this movie knowing what happens in its sequel many years later, the experience was further heightened for me. Seeing Goose's son Bradley on the piano during the Great Balls of Fire scene, knowing how much of an impact that had on Maverick when he eventually sees his son in the sequel. But there's also the mention of the Admiral's daughter from the one commanding officer on the ship that they're on in the beginning, which turns out to be Jennifer Connelly's character in the sequel. Also, that commanding officer, if you didn't know, was Strickland in Back to the Future. You got an attitude problem, McFly. You're a slacker. No McFly ever amounted to anything in the history of Hill Valley. And when you get there, you get all the usual stuff that you would see in something like this. The training montages, the flight sequences that we all want to see in a movie like this, where it's about the military. We want to see all the cool action scenes of the military showing off their capabilities. But the thing is, Tony Scott brings a really good amount of excitement to this movie. Now, he didn't do the sequel. It was Joseph Kosinski who took over. But even so, watching this movie, the tones are noticeably different, considering the time period of each respective movie. But in a lot of respects, it feels like they complement each other. This one is very colorful and bright and energetic. This was the 1980s, so the retro style is definitely present. In a lot of ways, it's a product of its time, so you kind of have to give it some leeway there. Since I mentioned the product of its era, the opening scene with Kenny Loggins' famous song, Highway to the Danger Zone, which we all know the lyrics to by now, and one that you hear on greatest hits stations on the radio all the time. Seeing the planes taking off and landing on the aircraft carrier as the song is blaring, that is one of the best opening sequences I've ever laid eyes on, and the fact that they recreated that in the sequel makes it even better. The interesting thing to note about this movie is that even though it's considered a classic in many ways, the initial response wasn't all that great, but the box office return said otherwise. You could say that it is in a lot of ways a crowd pleaser, but even so, a lot of people still talk about it to this day, even before the sequel came out. This movie, along with Risky Business, put Tom Cruise out there on the map, and ever since then, his career has never let up. And I think in this movie, he really sells the hot-headed loose cannon personality that you would want to see in a character like Maverick. But he also manages to maintain a certain type of likability because he's really good at what he does, and he knows what to do when certain things hit the fan. And he is the film's main protagonist, so you have to have him be relatable in some capacity. I also really like his bond with his friend Goose, played by Anthony Edwards, who also acts in a lot of ways a voice of reason for Maverick. He's got a wife and son to worry about, and he doesn't want to get kicked out and possibly get dishonorably discharged from the military, so he's got priorities to worry about, and Maverick doesn't really have anybody. And Maverick promises not to go off the rails again. He inevitably ends up doing so because he has too big of an ego. Does a flyby at a control tower, causing one naval officer to spill coffee all over himself. Which, again, happens at the climax of the movie when he does the flyby in the control tower on the aircraft carrier. And I also do like the romance that he develops with Kelly McGillis' character, Charlie Blackwood, who is a civilian employee for the US Navy with access to certain types of classified information and knows a lot about how military aircraft operate. And I think it's a natural progression of how the romance eventually blossoms. We all expect a romance in some capacity with a movie like this, but I think the way they play it out here is very effective. And seeing how they interact with each other when she's giving the instructions in the class, how they're subtly sparring with each other verbally over how much one knows in comparison to the other, without making it so obvious that they're interested in each other to everybody else in the room. It was a good move to play it that way. Otherwise, it would have come off as very cheesy. Then there's also Val Kilmer as Iceman. Iceman makes it clear that he does not like the guy at all, and is basically what Hangman was in the sequel, and they both feel the need to compete for the trophy when they eventually graduate Top Gun. But inevitably, he comes to respect Maverick by saying that you could be my wingman anytime when he sees him go back to save somebody who's about to be killed in the middle of combat. And I have to mention, that little bite that Iceman does, That is so bizarre. It's a small nitpick. It's not that big of a deal. Whenever I see somebody do that, though, I go, stop. It's so creepy. Don't do that. And I like how a lot of the instructors at Top Gun have the look and feel of those who are in the service. Tom Skerritt, or Viper, was actually in the Air Force for a few years before he starred in this movie. And that goes for Jester, who's played by Michael Ironside. But even though he was never in a branch of service, he clearly has a look of a hardened military veteran, so I think he was the perfect fit for that type of character. Another thing to note about the movie, as I talked about earlier with the opening sequence, is the flight scenes, or the action scenes, which we all would love to see happen. All this is showcased by the top-notch cinematographer Jeffrey Kimball, and not to mention the editing as well. Now, I don't know if they shot this from the planes in the sky. They might have. Maybe, I don't know. But even though it looks somewhat dated, this was 1986, it's really easy for me to say that because I've gotten so used to the flight sequences in the sequel, but I still think they're well handled in this one. But we do have to talk about Goose's death. A certain accident happens during a training exercise which causes the plane that they're flying in to spin out of control. This was a common problem in an F-14. They had a tendency to go into a flat spin like it does in the movie if they were at a certain angle for a certain amount of time. I'm not an aviation expert, so don't quote me on that, but according to my one buddy who's been following me for a few years now, sent me this information. And that knowledge actually really helps because Maverick is inevitably cleared of any wrongdoing. He had no intention for this to happen. But even so, the death of his buddy clearly shakes him up to the point where he's not even focusing during training. And this is where the movie gets really deep and becomes more than the sum of its parts. Just when you think he might actually quit and leave, Viper calls him to his home on a weekend and tells him certain information about his father, Maverick's father. Maverick's father was blamed for a certain incident that happened in Vietnam, but Viper, who was actually there to witness the whole thing, said that Maverick's father died heroically. Up until now, Maverick has never known about this. And this is the moment that propels him to get back in the game. Even though he ends up not winning the trophy, he still has enough points to graduate. To sidestep for a second, this kind of reminds me of this conversation in the second season of 24. Kiefer Sutherland's character, Jack Bauer, is about to take this nuclear bomb out into the middle of the desert in order to sacrifice himself, feeling like he has nothing left to live for. But his one boss, George, who's about to die, decides to take his place instead. Jack initially resists, but George gives a speech of saying, look, you want to be a real hero? You get back down there, put the pieces together, find a way to forgive yourself, you make things right with your daughter, and then you go on. That takes some real guts. And that's applicable to anybody in any rough spot that they've been in. And a small moment that I really like is that even though Iceman is not a fan of Maverick initially, after Goose dies, he tries to offer some words of comfort to him, but ultimately all he can say is that he's sorry and nothing else. Because what do you say to someone who lost their best friend? I think it's in a lot of ways a realistic look of how do you respond to someone who's experiencing a huge amount of grief. When they get called into combat, Maverick initially breaks away, saying that no, it's not good, it's too dangerous. His wingman, who's played by Tim Robbins, that was really crazy to notice that he was in this movie, and they end up reuniting in War of the Worlds many years later. Yeah. Isn't that wild? He's talking really loud in his ear, dude, get back in there, we need to help them. He's eventually able to snap back into reality and save his buddy, finally earning Iceman's respect. There's a lot of other stuff that I didn't mention and some other tidbits of information regarding the stuff about the planes and everything, but considering that I was sick and I actually went to a concert a few nights ago, I still don't have 100% of all the energy that I want. But all in all, Top Gun is just... To call this pure popcorn entertainment is kind of underselling it. It is in a lot of ways that type of movie, but when you get to Goose's death and you see how Maverick responds to it and is able to overcome that, at least in this movie anyway, that's where I think the movie really shines and shows its true colors. I don't know if I would call it my favorite Tom Cruise movie, but it is definitely up there. So those are my thoughts on Top Gun. Thank you guys so much for watching. What are your thoughts on the original Top Gun? Comment below and tell me what they are, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.